All right, welcome to NNP Symposium. We have Howard Engel is going to be speaking on the Canadian collector Bert Koper. And by way of introduction, Bert Koper, 1899 to 1963, a Dutch immigrant to Winnipeg, almost single-handedly kept the torch of organized numismatics burning in Canada through the dark years of the Depression and World War II. His Park Coin Shop, Canadian Numismatic Art Society, and subsequent Canadian Coin Club Society, active 1935 to 1951, filled the gap between the Antiquarian Numismatic Society of Montreal's demise in 1934 and the Canadian Numismatic Association's birth in Ottawa in 1950. Numismatic literature aficionados collect his publications. His enthusiasm inspires collectors today. He nearly succeeded in organizing a nationwide numismatics association. Koper burned out, but he passed the Canadian numismatic torch to the RCNA, Royal Canadian Numismatic Association. He is Engel's local example of an unsung numismatist whose contributions to the hobby is worthy of research. You may find such numismatists in your own backyard. Howard Engel is the proprietor of Richard Stockley books, handling numismatic and philatelic literature, is active in the Royal Canadian Numismatic Association. And with that, Howard, please go ahead and unmute and start your video. And we'll get the first slide teed up here. There we go.
Well, greetings and salutations, everybody. Welcome to my session on Bert Koper, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce you to, unless you've already, met him in your encounters, Bert Koper, and I'm presenting him. What I'd like to show is how he's a Canadian numismatic pioneer, how he became a tragic hero in the hobby, and also when we consider his contributions, how he's an archetype or a typical specimen, if you like, of a numismatist who looked beyond his own, collecting and so on to encourage others in the hobby. So if you can go to the next slide there, Len, please.
Sorry. There we go.
All righty. So yeah, that's well, I'll be looking at this a little bit later, but that's one of his 20 years before Hans Zoll in Canada. Some of you may have encountered Hans Zoll of Regina, errors and varieties person. Koper identified many of these 20 years prior. So we'll look into some of his discoveries and so on in the presentation. But he was also a member of the American Numismatic Association number 6002. And so we'll proceed. That's a little snapshot that he would give out to his customers at his Park Coin Shop. And as you can see, the one is conspicuous by its almost complete absence there. And this is the actual piece that I have in my own collection. Next slide, please. So yeah, so as I mentioned, this is what I would like to do, how he shone the light of numismatics in Canada from the gloom of the Depression through the dark years of the war, World War II, how as a tragic hero, he, in doing that, he did his darndest to set up a couple of national organizations, one before the war and one after. They got off the ground a little bit, but like prototype airplanes, they didn't get very far. However, I would argue with some of my colleagues who've also studied Koper, and from which I learned that he essentially laid the groundwork for the CNA, and then how he can be for you, I'm sure all of you, in wherever you are, have somebody like Bert Koper, not necessarily starting a national organization, but doing something very significant in the field, in the hobby, that that has been overlooked and maybe it could be rediscovered. And then that's just my branding it with my Richard Stockley books, numismatic literature and philatelic literature business card. Next slide. So yeah, that's just to launch our first part of the three parts of our session. Okay, so this is where he fits into our timeline. So if you consider the beginnings of the organized numismatics in Canada is often pointed back to even before our confederation, which was 1867. So in 1862, the Antiquarian and Numismatic Society of Montreal formed out of the Chateau de Ramsey in Montreal, and published off and on for a period of about 60 years their journal. So that's this first part here. And then in that organization, you had such giants as Joseph Leroux, the Médaille du Canada, and Pierre Breton, Le Collectionneur, their guides in the latter part of the 19th century. Ludger Gravel as well, who is very instrumental. Oh, not quite yet there yet. If you go back to the timeline,
Sorry.
That's okay. Oh, yeah, go back here. One more there. Yeah, Ludger Gravel, and who, by the way, was very instrumental in hosting the American Numismatic Association's conferences or conventions in Canada, in Montreal in 1909 and again in 1923. And around World War I, you had the because of that war, what activity there had been, from the beginnings in the 1860s in Canada of organized numismatics had sort of petered out by about 1920. This is one of the last organizations there to be meeting was the La Société Numismatique d'Ottawa, which had a number of very prominent numismatists in its organization, Campeau and Paquet and Thomas Church. So here we are in the middle here with Bert Koper, who, as I mentioned, or as Len mentioned at the beginning, was a Dutch immigrant, possibly or probably had been introduced to world coins, of course, in his travels on ships. He was a barber by profession. Landed in Winnipeg just after the end of World War I. His daughter Vera later indicated that he caught the numismatic bug around 1930. And after Gravel passed away in 1933, his collections were auctioned off in a series of auctions from the mid-30s through the end of the 30s. And Koper, in spite of his limited resources, I think he dipped into his substance, not just into his this so-called disposable income. And keep in mind, we're in the middle of the Great Depression here. He bought a very significant chunk of Gravel's tokens and medals, and it was in the I believe it was in the December 10, 1935 Morgenthau auction. And so that's when he took off. He started his coin shop that year, 35. He advertised extensively, as we soon shall see in the presentation. He became active in the ANA. He was a member by 1937. He was sponsored by none other than J.D. Ferguson and R.A. Renault, who became the curator of the numismatic collection at the Chateau de Ramsey. And Koper was an area district representative of the ANA for Western Canada, Prairie region, from 1946 through 49. And, you know, all in the midst of his starting up these two national organizations. And you can see here this after the war, or there was very little activity otherwise going on in Canada. There was the Toronto Coin Club began in 1936. Ottawa was reconstituted in 1948. There was a group of numismatists in the Ottawa area, including Pierre Brunet and Sheldon Carroll, who started meeting about a national organization. And that's when, you know, they, after a number of meetings, and then in 1950, through the Ottawa Coin Club, they decided to form this national organization that we know now. Well, it was initially the Canadian Numismatic Association, and since 2008, when they received the royal designation, the Royal Numismatic Association. Meanwhile, in Manitoba, during Koper was still around, but in 1954, the Manitoba Coin Club was founded, and which became the 8th chapter of the CNA in 56. And however, there's no evidence that Koper became a member of that organization or the Canadian Numismatic Association. He maintained the evidence I was able to dig up show that he maintained his membership in the ANA at least until 1957. So there you have it. You have sort of, you know, the organized numismatics in Canada was pretty thin gruel between the wars, but nonetheless, Koper was active and enthusiastic. It did, I think, all he could, and laid the groundwork for the later successful CNA. So just to put it in context of Canadian history, you know, we have from Confederation through the Royal Mint being established in 1908, and then becoming a bona fide Canadian controlled organization in 1931 through the Statute of Westminster. And so we can move to our next slide, please. Yeah, so just his signature there. One of his many letters. I was able to obtain a hoard of letters, correspondence from him, thanks to Ian Lang at Gate West Coin, who in his numerous acquisitions of local coin dealers over the years, I think he's bought out about 18 or 20 of them. And one of them had this, and he kept it, and I was able to acquire it from him. So move next slide. So this arrow, this yellow arrow there in the middle of this photograph from Winnipeg Transit calendar happens to be, as best I can tell, the shop. It's from the behind, unfortunately, but so far it's the closest thing I've found to a photograph of his park coin shop. The Roxy Theater, it's just behind there. For those of you who know Winnipeg, this is Henderson Highway in the old days with the, as you can see, a streetcar, which went out of service in 1955. This particular photo is probably around the early 50s. I'm guessing by the vehicle there. This vehicle is probably around a 1950 Pontiac or so, and so yes, so that's where he had his basis of operation, 377 Henderson Highway, and that's where they raised their daughter Vera, born 1927 and died in 2009. And like I mentioned earlier, he caught the numismatic bug in the early 30s there. So this is the eastern side of Red River in Winnipeg, the only part of Winnipeg that was east of the Red River until Unicity in 1972. So that's where Koper got started with his shop and with his Canadian Numismatic Art Society. Next slide. So yeah, so we'll just go through fairly quickly a number of some of his ads that I was able to find in the that he placed in the Winnipeg Tribune, which is one of our two of our major daily newspapers back in the day. In just the first year of his business, 35, he published an incredible 59 classified ads, and sometimes twice in one issue. So I think that was shows some of his enthusiasm. So this was the first one that I could find from March 28, 1935. Next slide. He also published a number of stock lists, or what we would now call fixed price lists. This one was from 1938, all mimeographed, of course, and stapled, as you can see. Next slide. And just to show, he used the numbering system for the tokens that were listed of the Breton catalog, which is still used today in colonial and or like pre-Confederation and post-Confederation tokens and medals, along with there's some other systems that are used as well, but Breton continues to be used. Okay, next slide. So there's a couple there. There is an example of two for one, two ads in the same paper. Get them while they're young. He encouraged, one of the ads is encouraging young people to get involved. So good strategy. Go next slide. And education in the hobby. He was known for doing a lot of research about pieces that he encountered or people brought to him, and he always sought to inculcate an appreciation of that in others. So it wasn't just he would be a bona fide collector or numismatist, and because he was interested in the history and the beauty, the intrinsic history and beauty of each piece, not so much as an investment and to flip and to make money on. Next slide. Again, another dual ad example. These ads talk about some U.S., British, world coins, tokens, and medals. He would also subscribe to that saying that's from Aaron Feldman, a New York dealer, a contemporary of his. Actually, I don't know that Koper ever heard about him or met him or anything like that, but certainly buy the book before you buy the coin. Next slide. Another couple of ads there. Next slide. He also advertised early on the Hudson Bay Company tokens and Northwest Company tokens, which are perennial electors, especially in Canada, but not, of course, outside Canada as well. Next slide, please. Now we've finally come to where he is advertising his one of his early catalogs. Next slide. And interestingly, he also solicited interviews of collectors. Like he wanted to know about collectors and what they collected. So I thought that was kind of a cool thing as well. So he's interested in that kind of a camaraderie with others in the field. Next slide. Just another advertising his shop once again. Next slide. Okay, and he announced in this one his Park Coin catalog. He and for $2.25, which is a fairly substantial amount of money in those days. And this particular catalog was, I think, I'm thinking that this one might be the one that was actually published in 1936. as you'll see. Okay, next slide. There it is. So this is an extremely rare catalog that Koper published. I've been, since I've been actively involved in numismatics in my adulthood, which has only been for the last 8 years or so, I only encountered, I've only had opportunity to buy it a couple of times, and this is I've acquired it the one time. The other time was at an auction more recently. This was I obtained my copy from a local dealer, Peter the Peddler, he goes by, in 2016, and so it's interestingly when we'll look at it a little more detail, but he used the engravings from Breton's guide. So that was published in 1894 and then revised in 1912. Okay, so if we could, and it just preceded Waite Raymond's guide of Canadian decimal coins by 1 year. Next slide. Again, then advertising some of his material. Next slide. So this one apparently was used as a galley proof or whatever to revise for another edition. Might have had something to do with the 1935 versus 1936. I'm not clear on that, but in any event, next slide. So there, those of you who are familiar with the Breton catalog can see right away what, that those are the same engravings. Next slide. These I thought I would show you because they're the north, what Breton I think termed as the Northwest. So these are the the famous Hudson Bay Company made beaver tokens that were I believe issued in 1857, and then the others are a few tokens from Winnipeg. There's one there that's for John Tobin's barbershop, where Winnipeg is misspelled. Instead of W-N-N-I, the second I is an E. So I guess Koper might have had a little affinity for that because it was a token for a barbershop, which is what he ran. As far as I know, he didn't issue any of his own tokens. Next slide. And so that's just the back cover and the last page of the guide advertising some of his own material. Next slide. So he not only advertised locally, but he also did so in popular mechanics. There was a fairly extensive classified section in that publication, and including a large, usually there were a lot of ads for coins and stamps, and so Koper, I guess, was familiar with the publication and thought he would put an ad in there. And I guess this is something maybe we've sort of lost appreciation for that method of advertising, the classified ads, because of the internet and everything nowadays. But in those days, that was a really effective way of advertising what you had. So he did that in 1936 in a couple of issues, and then again in 1939. Next slide, please. Yes, and as I mentioned earlier, Koper stands on on the shoulders of giants like Blücher-Gravel. That's the photo and the article there is essentially the death notice that appeared, or an obituary that appeared in the Numismatist from May 1933. Next slide. And one of the sales of Gravel's collection, one of the last sales in '39. Next slide, please. And this is the only auction sale that we know of, or I've encountered, that Koper ever did, you know, that for which there was a, at least for which there was a guide published. And so it was for a local collector, and the Money Museum at the Bank of Canada, the Numismatic Museum in Canada, has a copy. I've never seen one myself in the flesh as of yet, but I would dearly love to add this to my own collection. If any of you have ever encountered that, I would like to know. So I'll have my email prominently displayed at on the last slide. So next slide, please. And again, a couple more. These were his sponsors when Koper became the member number 6002 of the American Numismatic Association. So on the left, L.A. Renault, who is, again, was the Louis Rudolph Renault, and curator, who became the curator of the Numismatic Museum at the Château de Ramsey, which was part of the Antiquarian and Numismatic Society of Montreal. And then, of course, a youngish picture there of J.D. Ferguson when he was the Canadian president of the ANA from 1941 through 43. Next slide, please. And there, just to show where the entry where in the Numismatist from February 1937, where it was first announced that he was seeking, Koper was seeking membership in the organization. So in those days, you were sponsored by existing members, and then they kind of checked you out. And if you checked out okay, then you became a member, and that was published in a later edition of the Numismatists. Next slide, please. And then he advertised extensively in the Numismatist as well. And there were some articles also appearing there too about the Canadian Numismatic Art Society. See, I'm indicate there it was first known as the first name was the Winnipeg Numismatic Club, and then it became the Winnipeg Numismatic Society, and then the following year is when they changed the name to the Canadian Numismatic Art Society. Next slide, please. So now we're getting into the tragic hero part. So hopefully I've established how he was a pioneer in our history as of Canadian numismatics by his sheer activity and enthusiasm, and what he published, and and how he got his name known, got his name out there, and so on. And now we're going to focus more on his how he was instrumental in the laying some of the groundwork for a national numismatic organization in Canada. So next slide, please. So there's an early ad for the first, actually it was the second convention. The first one was under the banner of the Numismatic Art Society in 1938. So this in 39, it was the Canadian Numismatic Art Society, and they had a major exhibition and convention in Winnipeg in 1939. The convention, or exhibition rather, was at our very large Hudson Bay Company store on the corner of Portage Avenue and Memorial Boulevard, which takes up the entire city block, 6 stories high. Recently, it's just been closed. Last November, it was officially closed. It was built in 1926 originally, and we're not sure what's going to happen to it at this point. Next, so that's what the HBC is about there, in their auditorium. Next slide. So here's an example of an early membership card. This one belonged to the first vice president by the name of initial D, Dennis, and signed by the general secretary, Louis Brega. And then you can see Bert Koper's name on the top left hand there as president and editor of the Money Talks, eventually became known as Money Talks periodical, official periodical of the CNAS. Next slide, please. So there's a ribbon. I guess that's sort of the, if they didn't issue a official convention medal, this is the next best thing they could do. What they could do is issue a ribbon. And so that's what they did for this convention that was held in August of '39 there at the Hudson Bay Company Auditorium. And I obtained, that's an actual piece in my collection that I thankfully obtained from Paul Johnson, who was the RCNA executive secretary. So thank you, Paul. I think he's in our audience, I believe. And actually it was mentioned, it met probably in a letter that Paul was very close to J.D. Ferguson. And in a letter just before Ferguson's death in 1981, they discussed this ribbon, and it's probably belonged to J.D. Ferguson, who is in attendance at this show or convention. Next slide, please. So it was well documented in the local local papers. There's Koper on the left in that photo, a young collector in the middle, and another gentleman there. I'm not able to see who it was, but anyway. And they're all looking at this medal struck in Montreal commemorating Saint John Baptiste, who is their patron saint, Saint John Baptiste Day, June 24. And it's actually a national holiday in Quebec. And they could see, just even in the photo, how he's explaining sort of the nuances of the medal. You can't help but glean a little bit of the enthusiasm even from this photo. Next slide, please. Okay, here we are with Money Talks. It wasn't until the 4th issue that this title was settled on. It variously, it started off as Canadian Numismatic Coin Topics, which is rather cumbersome, and then Canadian Coin Topics. But when they started calling it Canadian Coin Topics, they got a letter from Waite Raymond saying cease and desist, because we've already got that name, they said there, and there it is there, the Coin Topics on the right, Waite Raymond's periodical from that same era. So they finally settled on Money Talks, and I think that was issue 4, and there was just a handful more issues under that title before the organization essentially, well, it died quietly during the war. 1941 was the last time they published a Money Talks. Next slide. Now, during the war and immediately thereafter, well, Koper, notwithstanding the organization, the CNAS was no longer in existence. He did publish a couple of what he would call numismatic treats. That was his term. The first one on the varieties of the 1858 and 1859 colonial, Canada was still a colony at that time, those colonial scents, and then a contemporary treatment there in 1946 of what were termed at the time blackout nickels, which were kind of a colloquial term for those 5-cent Canadian 5-cent pieces that were issued in 1942 and 43, made of tombac, which is an alloy of bronze and zinc, I believe. I think it's copper and zinc rather. 88% copper and 12% zinc, I believe, is the alloy. And the treatment of Koper focuses on the 42 issue in the publication. and talks about a number of varieties. So this is like 20 years prior to Hans Zoll, who did a very extensive treatment of Canadian errors and varieties in the early and mid 60s. Next slide. These are just a couple of, unfortunately, what I need to do is next time is put a much larger image of the varieties rather than try to do two in the same slide and so on. But anyway, these were part of the hoard I obtained from Ian Lang. So it was wonderful to have a couple of actual examples of varieties that were identified by Koper in that collection as well. So next slide. And this is some of the correspondence I was referring to earlier. I believe that's the one on the left, that letter on the left is where I got that early on. You saw Koper's signature. And then there's something about some varieties that he described in a letter that there was still existing, that still were in that hoard. So he was referring to those varieties of that 1 cent piece. I think it was from 1944, if I'm not mistaken. And he put on his cover there, a National Coin Week. Next slide. Oh, no, I'm sorry, those are for the 5 cent piece. Anyway, here we are back. This was the title slide. And that particular error is called a struck through grease error. So probably some detritus got into the die when it was struck, and that's why the 1 didn't show up the way it should. It's there. It's very, very faint. And almost, you know, if you don't look closely, it almost looks like it's not there at all. And so I thank my coin collecting friend, Brian Gibson, who's a local, you know, fellow member of the Manitoba Coin Club, who is a, I'm going to show you my pin here. 65th anniversary pin of the Manitoba Coin Club is right there. And I'm wearing my coin club shirt here. Anyway, thank him for identifying the actual, or naming the actual error. Next slide. And this was an interesting kind of a sideline that Koper got into, making his own coin boards. He actually had in his shop, he pressed into service his wife and daughter to help him make these coin boards. I've never seen one. I'm looking. I've even talked to coin board aficionado and expert David Lang there in the States about, and I think he's heard of them, but he has never seen one either. So anyway, if anyone encounters one, let me know. So it would be for Canadian coins. And apparently they made a lot of them, and they distributed them to collectors. So who knows? Could show up one day. But I think this is worth quoting from the daughter. And there's a letter that she sent to Daryl Atchison, who was the editor of the Canadian Numismatic Bibliography, and they were very persistent in obtaining an entry for Bert Koper in the bibliography, and especially a photograph. So they finally were able to track down the daughter at the time. This was back in 2002, 2003, and she wrote about these coin boards. I'll just quote her here. "How can I forget the drone of the drill press as I was trying to go to sleep? I knew my mom and I would be put to work putting the finishing touches on the coin boards my dad manufactured, gluing strips between the holes and then attaching the corners and trimming the edges with linen tape. Strips of cello went into, so like a cellophane went into the openings on both sides to protect the coins. Dad sold many of these to collectors, so there could be still some of them out there, hopefully. Yet to be discovered." Next slide. By the way, that's from the Numismatist from 1944. He advertised there. So this is the now we're post World War II in 1947. The I guess the second incarnation of, if you like, of this national organization that Bert Koper was trying to get going is called the Canadian Coin Collector Society, and this is the ad of it in 1947, and then this is actually, this ad indicates his being elected for I guess the second year, 1948. So so he's still at it and still trying to get something going. Meanwhile, however, there were people already by this time, as I mentioned, in Ottawa, trying to do something similar. So so the writing was on the wall, so to speak, you could say, for Koper, but nonetheless, hats off to him for doing the best he could. Next, next slide. And this is an example of the Canadian Coin Club Society membership card. I showed you the Canadian Numismatic Art Society before. So this was 10 years later. This one belonged to James Hunt Deacon, and those of you who are into Australian numismatics should recognize that name as who was a very prominent numismatist in Australia, and he was the curator of the Art Gallery of South Australia, their numismatic collection. And I learned, I'm thankful to Peter Lane, who's who became he was a mentee of James Hunt Deacon, and who shared this image, of course. And Peter Lane became a member, or either of the volunteer curator 40 years after James Hunt Deacon retired from that position. But Peter Lane actually wrote the definitive history of the organization, and he mentions one of a prominent Canadian numismatist in his work, R.W. McLaughlin, who they obtained, I think, some of their early Canadian pieces from him. Next slide. So here's an example of the new Canadian, new in quotation marks, Canadian Coin Club Society's official periodical called Canadian Money Talks this time around. But you'll notice from before, it was professionally printed, the other one. Now, because of lack of funds, they had to go back to mimeographing their issues. But nonetheless, put out several issues between the end of 1948 and the beginning of 1951. Next slide. Yes, so this is one of the last ads that I've found of this time the Park Coin Shop, because of course the national associations were now no more. 1958, so just at the beginning of 1958. Next slide. Now, question remains, what happened to Koper's collection? You know, he died in 1963, but he became incapacitated by 1960, 61. He ended up in Brandon in hospital there, and there are a couple. I have a theory. There were about a series of 3 major auctions of unusual and interesting, in quotation marks, tokens and metals, including this one from February of 1961. Actually, yeah, this one's from, I believe, from February 1961. Anyway, you'll notice if you can see that on the top, lots. Let me see. 107 and then 109 to 114 are rolls of Breton tokens, which is almost unheard of by this time. And who else could have had them but Koper? but we'll probably never know what actually happened. But it's a sad story, because it sort of just disappeared. His wonderful collection that he amassed over a period of decades, that he had largely early on with his acquiring of a major part of the Ludwig Gravel collection. Next slide. And again, the other company, local Winnipeg company that was involved with these auctions was Regency Coin and Stamp. That's Summer James. For those of you who might know, he was the not only the proprietor of Regency Coin and Stamp, but also head of the Canadian Numismatic Publishing Institute, who did those reprints of many of you would be familiar with the reprints of Breton's guide, and as well as Leroux's and the Betts medals, and Sandham's work were all reprinted by Summer James in the early 1960s. So those coveted reprints, they're really excellent, actually, well made. The Leroux one in particular has a number of other things that included a whole, like, I believe almost all or most of the Eugene Courteau token works are in there as well, included in the reprint, and so on. So, but nonetheless, there's these mysterious auctions that came up, and I suspect helped to disperse the Koper collection. Now, maybe they I'm not saying they stole anything. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying it's a mystery as to where they obtained these tokens and medals. And I suspect they got them from the Koper estate or somehow, but in any event. Yeah, and this particular one on the right, there's all of those lots are the engravings of the Breton and Leroux engravings that were used in their respective guides. And we know already that Koper had the ones from Breton, so chances are it's pretty high that these belong to were from the Koper collection. But again, you maybe never know for sure. Next slide. So now I'd like to about his being an archetype, or a specimen, a typical specimen of somebody that I would challenge anyone out there, somebody in your area, your city or state or province, or could well be somebody like Bert Koper, and unsung hero. And if you dig a little bit, you'll find out and be quite fascinated by that person. Next slide. So that's a tribute I came across to Koper after his death by the local club, the Manitoba Coin Club. So maybe even if Koper was not a member, I'm not sure, I don't know if he was, but I even if he wasn't, he was known by the members of the Coin Club, because they would have frequented his shop in the 50s, and they acknowledged him in that, which is quite touching, actually. And they indicated at the end of this tribute to him, his influence will be felt in the coin world for many years. So I think that's come true. It's quite prophetic, actually. Here we are, almost 60 years after his death. Next slide. So that's his grave site at the Brookside Cemetery in Winnipeg. Mitzpah is sort of it's a Hebrew word that means means something about an agreement, that God is the witness of agreement. So I like to think that all of Koper's transactions weren't just transactions. They were, he got into relationships with people, friendships that, for which God was the witness, and yeah, so that's at least provides me with some comfort there about that. Next slide. So yeah, so just as Koper stands on the shoulders of giants, so do I. lot of people I'd like to thank. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's a few I mentioned already, like Daryl Atchison, Ian Lang, and of course, not to mention Leonard Augsburger there, who's making me look good there with the technology, and but more importantly, ensuring that I would be able to present in the first place. So thank you, Leonard, and also Leanna Spurrier. If you get to the next slide, please. Mention Paul Johnson and Paul Petch. I would like to mention, especially because he was the one that gave me the idea of Koper shining this light, you know, between the demise of the Antiquarian and Numismatic Society of Montreal in the early 30s until the birth of the Canadian Numismatic Association in 1950. And also I'll just mention somebody I mentioned already, but Daryl Atchison was the one that gave me the idea for this laying the groundwork part, which I think is really really true. That Koper, notwithstanding the fact that his own organizations didn't succeed, he laid the groundwork that ensured CNA would succeed, and probably could do so much earlier than would otherwise have been the case, because many of the first members of the CNA had been members of Koper's organization, including S.S. Carroll and J.D. Ferguson, just to name a couple. So, of course, couldn't do any of this without my my partner and my spouse, my wife, Esther Juice, who's also in the audience. Hi, Esther. And next slide. So yes, I just laid down the gauntlet for you to as a challenge to maybe go back to where you are and see who's out there waiting to be discovered. Numismatist, the local numismatist, who wanted to do more than just collect for themselves, but wanted to promote the hobby in some way, shape, or form. And they're out there. There's no question about that. It's just a matter of finding out who they are. Next slide. And there we are. That's hopefully I've established Koper's pedigree as a Canadian numismatic pioneer, a tragic hero in his efforts to attempt to establish a national organization, and an archetype of a typical of someone you could find in your own backyard who did something significant for the hobby. And with that, I invite your questions if you'd like to carry on the conversation. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to point out my email address there. Well, it's richardstockley.books@mymts.net, for those you don't know. And I look forward to, we're at the end of there's no time for questions and answers, I'm afraid.
We just have one question here.
Okay.
Got a minute or two. Can you please mention some of the most important both coins and tokens in the Koper collection, and explain their importance to those of us not so familiar with this topic?
Oh my, wow, that's a good question. Well, he inheriting, or not inheriting, but obtaining much of Luigi Gravel's collection, there would be a number of rare pre-Confederation and post-Confederation tokens and medals. Confederation, of course, referring to where Canada became a country in 1867. So we're talking about like bouquets sous tokens, ships and colonies tokens, Vexator Canadiensis token, you know, the Magdalen Island, Hudson Bay Company, then medals like Confederation medals, Governor General's medals, medals of McGill University, as an example, and other institutions of higher learning, those kinds of things, and then some, you know, merchant tokens of various and personalized tokens like Grenny and Hooper and early numismatist. Hooper, by the way, who was an early one of the founding early Canadian and members of the American Numismatic Association when it first got started. Those kinds of things would be among Koper's, among Canadian decimal material, of course, later on and so on. But he was also into world coins and ancients and as well. So he didn't limit his collecting. He's quite eclectic in his collecting interests. So hopefully that helps.
All right, and then one last question here. What would you say was Koper's most significant contribution or discovery in the field of numismatics?
Again, I would point to his yeoman's efforts in trying to establish a national organization. And as I say, notwithstanding on the surface of it, you could say he failed. But at the same time, like they did last for a few years, there were up to 100 members each time, including many prominent numismatists from the day. And in addition to, I've mentioned already, J.D. Ferguson, S.S. Carroll, also W.A.D. Lees, Judge Lees, known for the ships and colonies tokens research. Professor Prince from New Brunswick. There's also locally speaking Andrew Browning Baird. So these people were involved. But more importantly, again, he laid some of the groundwork or foundations for a national organization that would eventually succeed. So I think that was his main claim to fame. But notwithstanding, he also has those collectibles that those of us who are interested in early numismatists, there were a lot of these prominent numismatists were published articles in the periodicals. So I would encourage you to some of these are available through online and so on. So yeah, that's how I would respond to that question. Thank you.
All right, we're out of time here, so unfortunately we'll have to cut it off there. But
okay.
Howard, thank you so much for presenting on this topic.
Thank you. Much pleasure.
All right, thanks a lot, everyone.